Spicy title, right? That I, with the stature of an ant, dare criticize the giant that is J.R.R. Tolkien. Dare to say what I believe he got wrong. I'm just joking around. I feel like my love of Tolkien and his writings is, well, evident in the fact that I have this YouTube channel, that I have this passion to talk about his works and to share them with a wider audience. So why would I make this video? Well, someone asked, and I thought it was a good idea. And ultimately, I believe that anyone, or anything, shouldn't be put on a pedestal, and that everything should be open to criticism. You see, I like trying to know everything there is to know about Tolkien's work, but there is an unfortunate reality to that. The more you know, the less magical it all feels. You stop looking at things from a perspective of wonder and curiosity, and more from the perspective of an analyst. As a result, you tend to notice the flaws, and while it's often been my role in my videos to try and explain these flaws away, I'd be lying to myself if I said that I was entirely satisfied with those explanations. I have put videos out where I feel like I'm making a massive reach to make it all fit together. So what was Tolkien's biggest problem, and where could you find it? It's not any storytelling. With the amount of stories Tolkien wrote and how grand a scale many of them are, it's remarkable that he was able to avoid any real major plot holes. Likewise, Tolkien's characters are also completely fine. Perhaps by modern standards, some of them are one-dimensional, but even some of those characters are incredibly deep, and most importantly, they're consistent. So if not the story, if not the characters, then where is the problem? It's in the world building. That sounds like an insane statement, right? We're talking about the guy who invented a mythological past of our own world, a guy who invented several partial languages, came up with over 1,000 characters, histories of entire nations, lineages of bloodlines that persisted for thousands of years, a guy who redefined our imagery of creatures like elves, dwarves, and orcs. It really isn't a stretch to say that Tolkien's world building has heavily inspired almost 100 years of fantasy. But there is one thing. Throughout Tolkien's work, he repeatedly struggled with demographics. Specifically, he struggled with population sizes, population growth, and population decline. This might seem like a small detail, but in the vast history of Middle-earth, growth and decline obviously plays a major role. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, it's the reason why certain places are the way they are. It's the reason why places like Eriador are empty, and places like Rohan are not. Now, it's not like Tolkien just completely ignored demographics, because he didn't. He actually did put some thought into it, as evidenced by a lot of his notes that were published after his death. I'll bring up a few examples in a moment. But this kind of just adds to the problem. In some cases, Tolkien was very careful with his approach to demographics, yet in other cases, he completely ignored it. He changes the rules if the story or history of his world demands it. This is fair enough, you want the broad strokes complete before the meticulous little details, but there's no denying that it causes some issues within the world building. So let's look at some of the examples of Tolkien doing demographics right. The first is Numenor. Tolkien tells us that the starting population of Numenor was between 200,000 to 300,000. However, there's an issue with this figure, but I'll get to that much later. He then tells us that by the year 1000, 1,000 years after Numenor's founding, Numenor's population was probably around 2 million. When you take into account the fact that Numenorian generations were much longer, between 75 to 100 years compared to 20 to 30 for regular men, you can see how this much growth comes across as reasonable. By the downfall of Numenor, this figure has reached 15 million, with several million more across Numenor's colonies. This is 3,300 years after Numenor's founding. The generations got shorter due to lifespan decrease, and there was exponential growth. Obviously, if you mathematically deconstruct all of this, there might be issues, but on a surface level, it seems fine. Another example is the Aethiod and their Rohirrim descendants. The original Aethiod were a remnant of the Northmen of Rhovanion who escaped the Easterlings. They settled in the Vales of Anduin, and after 150 years, they find their lands too small and move to the upper Vales of Anduin. 500 years later, and they're once again heavily constrained in their lands, so when the opportunity comes to settle the land that would become Rohan, they take it. Around 250 years later, Rohan's population is significantly reduced following the long winter. It then takes the Rohirrim over 100 years to recover. Once again, here we see reasonable population growth, which eventually requires migration, and population decline due to large-scale events. Tolkien also set rules that explained why races such as elves and dwarves never grew to such massive numbers. in the case of the elves, they often didn't have children until they were at least 2,000 years old, and more commonly 3,000, meaning that in times of prolonged warfare, it wasn't uncommon for elves to die without children. The Sons of Feanor are a great example. They were all aged between 2 to 3,000, and only one of them had a child before they died. We're also told that elves rarely had more than 4 children, and following the First Age, it was an option to sail into the west. Thus, you can see why the elves steadily weakened from the Second Age onwards. It was similar for the dwarves. Tolkien tells us that dwarven women only made up around a third of the total population, and on top of that, not all dwarven women married due to a number of different reasons. As a result, less than half of the dwarven male population even got married, and similar to the elves, dwarves were considered adults long before they had children, which was usually around 100, meaning that in times of war, it also wasn't uncommon for dwarven men to die without having children. From the House of Durin alone, we have 4 male members of the house die in battle before the age of 90. So, once again, like elves, we can see why the dwarven population grew so slowly, and in times of war, why heavy losses were so catastrophic. I feel like it's such a Tolkien thing to make a video where I'm criticizing some of his work, and yet I've still just spent the last few minutes praising it. Okay, hopefully you got my point right. From these examples, you can see that Tolkien did put thought and effort into demographics. He didn't just pave over it and hope that people didn't notice. And with elves and dwarves in particular, you can see that those simple rules about the characteristics of both races is enough to explain the reasons why their demographics are the way they are. So, now to the part of the video where I show you the times where Tolkien didn't really give a shit about those rules. I'm going to start with population decline. Decline is a central part of the theme of Middle-earth, the concept of the long defeat. And if you've been following my channel long enough, and if you're aware of some of my favourite parts of the Legendarium, you might know exactly what I'm going to talk about. If you guessed Arnor and Eriador, congratulations, you got it 100% correct. I've done a few videos on this topic, specifically relating to Arnor and Eriador, so now it's time to talk about how I really feel about it. If you're familiar with the history of Arnor, then you know that Arnor's tale was one of constant decline. It suffered from depopulation early in the Third Age, and then it split into 3 successor kingdoms who were embroiled in constant civil wars, and finally, it fought a 600-year-long war with Angmar that eventually resulted in its destruction. On the surface, this seems fine, but when you delve a little deeper, some of Tolkien's reasonings fall a little flat. For example, at the beginning of the Third Age, Arnor enters decline despite being at peace. Apart from the mystery of the early death of King Valander, there's no indication that Arnor suffered any major conflicts during this time, so there's no reason the population should have steadily declined. The official reason that Tolkien gives us is that Arnor suffered large casualties during the War of the Last Alliance, and that they then had to abandon some of the places that they had built. But losses from a single war, which wasn't even fought on Arnor's territory, shouldn't cause a kingdom to enter a period of terminal decline for 800 years, to the point where even the capital city had to be abandoned. Even for the long-lived Dunedain, that was 8 generations, more than enough time to recover. Of course, decline throughout the rest of Arnor's history does make sense. Constant civil war gradually weakened the kingdom, especially the Dunedain elite. Then Angmar's genocidal invasions did irreparable damage, depopulating large swaths of Eriador, and in the case of the Barrow Downs, repopulating them with the terrifying and deadly Barrow-wights. The Great Plague, which, although it didn't really reach Arthedain, did a lot of damage to southern Eriador, and then Angmar's final invasion finished the job. With the destruction of Arthedain, it made sense that Eriador would be a depopulated wilderness. But then Tolkien demographics kick in again. With Angmar's destruction, Eriador was free of enemies, and over the next 1,000 years, the population should have bounced back. It makes sense for the Dunedain to remain small in number, they're being secretive, and are doing the dangerous dirty work of keeping the land safe. But apart from them, there were 3 population centres in the Shire, Bree, and Tharbad that should have gradually expanded. But while the Shire did expand a little with the settlement of Buckland, Bree spent over 1,000 years being one small town and a few small villages, and Tharbad decayed and was eventually destroyed by floods. In one of my videos, I did try to explain this by saying that the surviving peoples of Eriador had neither the strength nor the ambition to repopulate Eriador, and this is true to an extent, but realistically, over the course of 1,000 years, the men of Bree, for example, should have gradually expanded outwards. Even without a central force driving that effort, they still should have experienced population growth. Middle men grew faster than the Dunedain, and as far as we know, Bree didn't implement a one-child policy. This is an example of Tolkien putting the story over the world building. That's not to say that he planned this out extensively, given The Hobbit was a standalone that was written well before any proper world building was done when it came to Eriador, but rather, it worked out well to have Eriador a depopulated wilderness. It made the adventures of Bilbo and later Frodo more exciting, so there was no real reason to change it. The fault lies with not doing a better job of explaining why Arnor originally declined, and why Eriador didn't bounce back. But once again, this only really becomes an issue if you delve deeper into it. On a surface level, it all works and creates a background for the story. Another example of odd demographics pops up with Gondor, Arnor's sister kingdom, although I find this example much less of an issue. Unlike Arnor, Gondor actually grew in power until about the middle of the Third Age, and then it began to decline. First a civil war, then a deadly plague which wiped out a significant chunk of the population, and then constant wars with external powers. But by the end of the second millennia, Gondor was still powerful enough to absolutely wipe the floor with Angmar. Then, Gondor experienced a 400-year-long period known as the Watchful Peace. Tolkien tells us that the Watchful Peace allowed for Gondor to recover its strength, as it should. 400 years is a long time. To put that into perspective, that allowed for 9 generations of stewards to live and die in peace. At this time, these guys were living for 120 years or more, so for lesser men, that's even more than 9 generations. But once again, a disconnect appears in the story and how demographics should work. Despite explicitly saying that Gondor was able to recover its strength, the Gondor that emerges on the other side of the Watchful Peace comes across as much weaker from a story perspective. For example, a surprise attack from Mordor overruns Ithilien. This is fair enough, it's a surprise attack, and Gondor does end up counterattacking and recovering all the lost territory, but 4 years later, we're brought to the Balkoff invasion. Tolkien writes about this extensively in what was published during the Unfinished Tales, and he paints a picture of the situation being quite dire for Gondor. They don't have the ability to defend their frontiers anymore, thus Steward Kirion sends messages to the Aethiode asking for help. If the Aethiode did not arrive to save Gondor's army, Gondor might have been overrun. If this had occurred after several hundred years of war, then it would make sense, but after 400 years of peace, Gondor's power should have recovered extensively. Instead, we're told that places like Calanadon and Ithilien were still in decline. Okay, fair enough, these were frontier locations now, but Gondor's large, well-protected heartland should have been prospering. Mordor did attack before the Balkoff did, so you could reasonably explain this by saying that the war they fought first was actually extremely draining on Gondor. Tolkien didn't really give that impression, but it's certainly possible given that he never really went into too much detail about many of the more minor conflicts throughout Middle-earth's history. As I said earlier, I find this example less egregious. I think it's another example of Tolkien's work on demographics being undermined by the huge periods of time that were involved. After 100 years, sure, maybe Gondor wouldn't have recovered, but 400 years? That's less explainable. 400 years of peace is a long time. It's actually the second longest period of peace Gondor ever experienced, the first being the one it experienced at the very start of the Third Age. This should have made a major difference. Okay, so there's 2 examples of the population in Tolkien's work either growing very slowly, or even declining when it really shouldn't be. But that's only half the issue. As I said at the start of the video, decline is a major theme in Tolkien's work, so things like this would be forgivable if it was consistent across all of his works. But it's not, because just as the populations in Middle-earth sometimes decline without real explanation, sometimes they explode without explanation, to the point where you genuinely wonder, where did these people come from? I talked about Numenor as being an example of Tolkien doing a decent job with demographics, and it is, I'm not taking that away. But I did mention that there was an issue with Numenor's starting population of 300,000, and that issue is the one I just said before. Where did these people even come from? For some background, the first Numenorians were the Edain survivors of the First Age. The Edain were never large in number. When they arrived on the scene in 310 of the First Age, Tolkien actually gives us their numbers, which is a rarity. He tells us that the Beorians numbered roughly 5,000. the Halladin a little more, and the Hedorians numbered 15,000. Given Numenor was founded about 300 years later, it's not out of the question to think that 25,000 Edain could turn into 300,000 Edain, especially now that they had become settled peoples. But that would ignore the part where the Edain only had about 145 years of peace before everything went to hell. The Baorians were almost wiped out and merged with the other two houses. The Halladin never really grew all that much in number and were also almost wiped out, mostly by themselves I might add. The Hedorians did grow in number and fared much better than the other two houses, but even they were enslaved by Morgoth and the Easterlings for over 70 years before the War of Wrath began. Very few of the Edain were free at this point, clinging onto the Isle of Balar with the remaining elves, or wandering the lands as outlaws. So, to put it bluntly, there being 300,000 Edain left at the end of the First Age is ridiculous. After the genocidal wars Morgoth waged against them, and the enslavement and misfortune they endured, realistically, even a third of that number being around at the end of the First Age seems like a stretch. Because if you've read the Silmarillion, you should be aware of how depressing a picture Tolkien paints at the end of the First Age. There doesn't seem like there's much room for a population of Edain to be hanging around somewhere having a good time. It feels like, well, 250,000 Edain came out of holes in the ground, ready to populate Numenor. There's one possible explanation for this, and that's that Tolkien wasn't just talking about the Edain from Beleriand, but also included those Edain, or pre-Numenorians as they would become known as, who never crossed the Blue Mountains or did, and later returned to Eriador. If that's the case, then there definitely should be 300,000 people around ready to cross to Numenor, given that Eriador suffered far less extensively than Beleriand. But Tolkien never indicates this either. Nothing tells us that the Edain in Eriador got a free ride because the Edain in Beleriand did all of the hard work. Once again, it's not like this breaks the idea of Numenor. After all, this is all background lore, and I might add, lore that you can only find in the Peoples of Middle-earth and in the Nature of Middle-earth, two books that aren't exactly casual reading. But for me, it's an example where Tolkien was either willing to ignore his own rules regarding demographics, if he had any, or that he simply never considered this an issue, which in that case, I would really like to ask him where these 300,000 Edain came from, but unfortunately, that might be a bit of a problem. I do have another example, but just like the Gondor to Arnor example, this one is less egregious because there are possible explanations. This one is in regards to the Kingdom of Dale after the events of The Hobbit. For a refresher, the prosperous city of Dale was destroyed by Smaug when he sacked Erebor, and at least some of the survivors ended up in Lake Town, Esgaroth, a wooden town on the long lake south of Erebor. Later, Smaug was killed attacking Esgaroth, but not before he set fire to the town, and upon his death, his lifeless corpse fell onto the remnants of the town, completely destroying it. To be fair, Tolkien said that 3/4 of the town's population actually managed to escape the fire, but more died in the following days from cold and sickness. The survivors then took part in the brutal fighting that was the Battle of the Five Armies, and after the victory against the Orcs, Bard became king, and both Dale and Lake Town were rebuilt. In the years that followed, the Bardings grew powerful, and by the time of King Brand, Bard's grandson, their borders reached the rivers Kelduin and the Carnan. This is a lot of growth for what was the survivors of one small town. Not only did they repopulate Lake Town and the city of Dale, but they also expanded the kingdom's borders far to the south and east, in the space of a bit over 70 years. This is a little bit of a stretch, but once again, to be fair, it's not outside the realm of possibility, especially if you consider the fact that Bard's kingdom might have absorbed Northmen who dwelt outside of both Esgaroth and Dale. All they might have needed was a centralizing force to unite them all. But once again, it's another example of Tolkien bending his world building to suit the story. In the case of Dale, Tolkien needed them to be a strong opposition against the Easterlings during the War of the Ring, so he had them rapidly expand without a real strong explanation. The population of one town, within the space of 78 years, grew to become a reasonably strong, prosperous kingdom that stretched thousands of square miles. But then you compare this to Bree, another small town, and we see that Bree didn't expand at all for over 1,000 years. Sure, Dale had a king, Bree did not, but that doesn't dictate whether population grows or not. These four examples, the declining and stagnating population of Arnor and Eriador, Gondor's population not recovering when it should have, the 300,000 Edain that spawned out of nowhere, and the Kingdom of Dale going from one small town to a strong kingdom within 3 generations, show that Tolkien could be incredibly inconsistent when it came to demographics and population. If the story demanded it, he was willing to throw all logic out of the window, or at the very least, he did not provide strong enough explanations to explain how these things happened. Sure, he would let us know if a place grew or declined, but those words alone are vague descriptors, and can often leave more questions than answers. I would be lying if I said it didn't frustrate me. If you've followed this channel long enough, you should be aware by now that world building is my favourite aspect of Tolkien's work, more so than the stories or the characters. That being said, I do love it all. And I don't think any of what I just mentioned is a real problem. It doesn't really take away from the quality of Tolkien's work. It's not like the world building fundamentally breaks down because of it. And realistically, you're not going to notice these issues unless you go looking for them, or you have a Tolkien YouTube channel. And honestly, it's totally fine to have issues with the world building, because at the end of the day, while world building can be excellent, inspiring even, it's not that alone that makes a world interesting. It's the stories that are told in that world, and the characters that are in them. Sure, maybe the population of Eriador should have grown, maybe civilization should have returned, but then think about the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. It wouldn't have been remotely the same. No Old Forest, no Barrow Downs, no Weathertop, no flight to the Ford. It would have just been Frodo and company walking from town to town. I guess what I'm saying is that, yes, Tolkien's world building did have problems. Would I love an explanation? Absolutely. But considering that's not possible, would I have it changed? Absolutely not. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. This idea was put forward in one of my comments. I'm sorry, I don't remember which user suggested it, so whoever you are, you should feel proud because you made me put out one of my longest videos yet. As I said at the start of the video, I don't think anyone should be put on a pedestal, so I think it's fair to criticize aspects of Tolkien's work, as long as it's done in a fair way, just like everything else. And I hope you all feel the same. Cheers, farewell, and remember, farewell and cheers.